Greetings. Greetings in the name of Jesus to Victoria Citadel, our friends and family, and to our friends who are watching who are not from Victoria Citadel. Thank you so much for gathering today for worship. And the good news today is the Lord has risen. He has risen indeed. Yes, he's still alive. For announcements, I just want to remind you of last week's announcements that the territorial publications like Faith and Friends are now digital temporarily. When things clear up, we'll go back to having paper to hold. We also want to remind you that the territorial leaders are doing weekly services for Sunday, and you can go to youtube.com/Salvationist Magazine and find them there and see what's going on in that end of the world. There's also at www.salvationist.ca/COVID-19 updates on COVID-19. To remind you again, new officers will still be commissioned in late June, but it will happen in Winnipeg instead of in Toronto as planned. Announcement date of officer moves will still be April the 24th, but Farewell Sunday will be August the 9th. And that is the written out announcements. And the other announcement is that don't forget to be tithing and giving your gifts. You can do that at salvationist.ca, or you can mail your cartridges in, or you can slide them under the door. So, a story for all the kids. Hi, kids. This is a story about Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth. And he was the son of Jonathan, who was King David's best friend. King David's best friend, Jonathan, was also the son of King Saul, who was an enemy of David. And the two of them made war a lot until King Saul and Jonathan were finally killed. So then there was more wars between the Saul side of the faction and the David side, lots of wars. And then, finally, David was crowned as king. And he turned out to be a pretty good king, mostly. And one day he said, "Did my friend Jonathan have any family? Because we swore we'd take care of each other's family. And I'm not doing that." And so his servant said, "Yes, there is a son, a grandson of King Saul, a son of Jonathan, and his name is Mephibosheth. He's a crippled in both feet." So David said, "Well, bring him here." Well, think about Mephibosheth as he heard that. He was one of the last remaining relatives of the enemy, King Saul, of the new King David. And he was crippled, so he couldn't do too much. He had been crippled when his nursemaid was running away from war with him, and she tripped and he was just kind of wrecked. So there he is, ordered to go to see the king, and he was pretty sure he was going to have his head cut off, because that's what kings did. They didn't allow other family members to stay alive. So he went stumping down the hallway, marble hallways I would imagine, and his crutches were bang, shuffle step, thumping along. And then he got to see David, and David ran up and hugged him and said, "Oh, you look just like Jonathan. I loved him so much. I would like to invite you to have lunch with me every day from now on." And Mephibosheth, who was expecting to have his head cut off, said, "Well, I think that I should be nothing more than a dog to you because I'm on the enemy side." And David said, "No way, I promised your father Jonathan." And then he said to his servant, "I want you and your family to take care of Mephibosheth. All of the houses and lands that belonged personally to King Saul and to Jonathan are going to be for him, and you are to serve him and take care of him." And Mephibosheth was just in awe. He was being invited to eat at the king's table till the end of his life. And last week when we were learning about Daniel, we learned that Daniel wouldn't eat food from the king's table because that meant that he was associating with the king and that they were partners or allies. So he didn't want to have the king's food because he wanted to keep himself separate. But Mephibosheth was happy to eat the king's food and restore the friendship that had been between his father, Jonathan, and King David. So that's a good thing to think about. Sometimes it's not a good thing to eat at the king's table, and sometimes it is. And that's the end of the story. Today's scripture reading is Daniel chapter 1. The book of Daniel, chapter 1, the whole thing. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men, chosen all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded." Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared with the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained in the royal service until the 1st year of the reign of King Cyrus. And God always blesses the reading of his word.
Good morning. A virus, SARS-CoV-2, spreads across the world. An earthquake shakes the ground beneath your feet and rattles your sense of safety and security. A hurricane blows away a lifetime of memories. A drunk driver claims an innocent victim. A divorce shatters a home. International, national, and personal tragedies can make our world a fearful place at times. It can even cause us to think that God has abandoned us, that He doesn't care about us. Where are you, God? We cry out when overcome by fear, anxiety, and despair. Well, 26 centuries ago, Daniel could have asked the same question as he and his people were taken captive to a foreign land, Babylon, after their capital city of Jerusalem had been besieged. Daniel would end up growing up to adulthood and spending the rest of his life in a foreign land, giving the best years of his life in the service of a foreign king. So what do you do when you find yourself, like Daniel, living in Babylon? Living in a culture that can be at odds with, sometimes even hostile towards, your faith. Well, as we began to look at the life of Daniel last week, we noted that he had what researchers in the social sciences call resiliency. Resiliency is that capacity to thrive in challenging, difficult situations. And so, though being taken from his home and carried off into exile in a foreign land, Daniel learned, with God's help, not just to survive, but to thrive in Babylon. He was able to remain faithful and obedient to the Lord his God in a culture that was sometimes at odds with, even hostile towards his faith. And what we discovered last week was that the first step he took, and the first step we can take to becoming spiritually resilient, is to resolve to honor God with our lives. So I'd like us to continue to walk through Daniel chapter 1 as we discover two more steps Daniel took that will enable us, like him, to become spiritually resilient people. So what then is the second step that people can take to becoming spiritually resilient? Step number 2 is to commit to community. Commit to live in community. Daniel lived in community with his 3 friends. Those 3, verse 6 tells us in Daniel 1, were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, renamed by the Babylonians Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They went through U of B, the University of Babylon, together, verse 17. They studied, they prayed, they faced difficult and daunting situations together. And one day they would help to rule Babylon together. When you live in Babylon, when you live in a culture that can be at odds with your faith, perhaps even hostile to that faith, you will not survive, let alone thrive, outside of having a strong sense of community. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shoemaker is a prime example of this. Back in 1965, when Shoemaker was a lieutenant commander in the Vietnam War, he became the second American aviator to be shot down and captured by the North Vietnamese. He was held in several prisons, including the infamous Hanoi Hilton, where he was beaten, tortured, and spent long periods, up to 3 years, in solitary confinement. You think we have it tough with social isolation. Shoemaker was also involved in the development of a TAP code used by fellow POWs. This code enabled prisoners isolated in separate cells in their solitary confinement to communicate with each other by tapping letters out on the prison walls. For himself and other POWs, the briefest experience of community, of being connected through their TAP code, enabled them to survive. For us, having a sense of community, of enduring friendship, of spiritual intimacy, does not come easily. It's something we have to fight for. And when you struggle with some difficult problem or decision, do you have people within this faith community at Victoria Citadel who will support you, help you, pray for you, give you wisdom when needed? I wonder if you have any idea what difference it makes when you take the time to use your own tap code to say to someone, even in these days of social isolation, by phoning, emailing, or connecting on social media, God bless you. I'm praying for you. What can I do to help? People in this Corps need to hear the tap code, not just POWs. We will never become spiritually resilient outside of a commitment to community, especially now in the face of this global pandemic. So make a commitment to live in community. It's essential to becoming spiritually resilient. Well, what then is the third step we can take that will enable us, like Daniel, to become spiritually resilient people? Step number 3 is to believe or be convinced that God is in control, even in the midst of your suffering. Daniel was spiritually resilient. He remained faithful and obedient to God while living in exile in Babylon because he was convinced that God was in control, even in the midst of his suffering. I'd like us to work backwards, starting at verse 17 of Daniel chapter 1. To these 4 young men, that's Daniel and his friends, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. Then back up to verse 9. Now God had caused the official, Ashpenaz, to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. And then back to verse 2 of chapter 1. And the Lord delivered or gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. So who is it that keeps getting mentioned in these verses? It's God. Daniel discovers and is convinced that God is in control, that he is at work even in the midst of all his suffering. The suffering of seeing Jerusalem besieged, of being taken out of Jerusalem and exiled, losing his family, his culture, even his name, having to spend the rest of his life in a foreign land in the service of a foreign king. Being convinced that God was in control, even in the midst of his suffering, was another step that Daniel took to becoming spiritually resilient, to remaining faithful and obedient to God while living in a culture often at odds with, sometimes even hostile towards, his faith. Now, while we may be able to say, yeah, I believe God is in control, even in the midst of this global pandemic, we may have a more difficult time to accept that this is true. The words can be easy to say, but do we really believe, are we really convinced that it's true? Oftentimes we want to know the answer to our anguished cries of why. While we may draw some measure of courage to endure suffering from the fact that Jesus himself asked why while suffering on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Spending all our time trying to figure out why can drive us insane. As G.K. Chesterton reminds us in his story, The Magician. It's a story of a magician who visited a town and was performing a number of tricks to entertain the crowd. And while everyone was thoroughly enjoying his performance, a young scholar sitting near the front of the auditorium persisted in finding his own explanation for every trick. The magician was getting rather exasperated and finally came up with a trick that this young scholar would be unable to explain. He called the scholar over and asked him, "What was the color of the light outside your home when you left this morning?" The scholar answered, "Red." "All right, run along home," said the magician, "and even as you are running, I will turn it into a green light." "Oh, you can't do that," retorted the young man. "Oh, yes, I can, and I will," came the reply. The young scholar began to run towards his house, and as he came within a few feet of it, he saw the light change color from red to green. Completely astounded, he turned and ran back to the magician. "All right," he asked, "how'd you do it?" The magician looked at him and said, "Oh, I just sent a couple of angels to change the bulb." "Oh, that's nonsense," said the young man. "Tell me how you did it." No matter how belligerently the scholar protested, he always received the same answer. "I sent a couple of angels to change the bulb." Well, the young scholar retreated to his laboratory, trying to figure out how a red light can be changed to a green light. He became so obsessed with this quest that he finally went insane. His sisters came to the magician and implored him to give his trick away just this once, so that their brother's sanity would return. "But I have already told him the truth," he said. "All right then," asked the sisters, "why then don't you tell him something that's not true, but sounds reasonable? At least it will help him recover his sanity." Well, the magician reluctantly agreed and fabricated an explanation for his trick, which the young man then readily accepted and eventually regained his sanity. The point in telling this story is that for us, trying to figure out why can drive us insane. Therefore, I would argue, no single truth removes the need to ask why more than when we are convinced that God is in control. And being in control, says Chuck Swindoll, he is too kind to do anything cruel, too wise to make a mistake, and too deep to explain himself. Oh, the depth of the riches of the knowledge, wisdom, and knowledge of God, writes Paul in Romans 11:33. How unsearchable are his judgments, and unfathomable his ways. Like Daniel, we can become spiritually resilient people. People who remain faithful to God while living through this pandemic, while living in a culture that can be at odds with, sometimes even hostile towards our faith, when we resolve to honor God with our lives, when we commit to live in community, and when we are convinced that God is in control, even in the midst of our suffering. Annie Johnson Flint was a spiritually resilient person. She lived most of her life in pain. Orphaned early in life, her body was embarrassed by incontinence, weakened by cancer, twisted and deformed by rheumatoid arthritis. She was incapacitated for so long that, according to one eyewitness, she needed 7 or 8 pillows around her body just to cushion the raw sores she suffered from being bedridden. And yet, she was still able to pen words that touch the hearts of when we're facing our most despairing moments. He giveth more grace as our burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength as our labors increase. To added affliction, he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials, he multiplies peace. I pray you carry with you the words of that song this week. God bless you.